All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Beasley Allen webinar, Youth, Facebook, and Mental Health, What's the Connection? My name is David Byrne, and it's my pleasure to introduce our two keynote speakers for this very important and timely litigation topic. Today, my partners Jennifer Emmel and Clinton Richardson will discuss the methods and effects of technology employed by social media. They'll address the harms that it causes children and adolescents, and they'll provide an overview of the litigation and the regulations surrounding social media. Before I introduce our two speakers, and while we're waiting on the last of our registrants to join us today, this is probably a good time for us to go over a few housekeeping notes. First, this webinar has been approved by the Alabama State Bar for 1 hour of CLE credit. In order to receive full credit for attending, you gotta stay on at least 50 minutes. For your convenience, a copy of our presentation is uploaded in the chat box. We've also uploaded an evaluation form for you to return to webinars@beasleyallen.com. That's webinars@beasleyallen.com. Every attendee will receive an email that will include the evaluation form, the presentation, and a link to the video. For those of you who are participating today by phone, please email your name and phone number to that same address I gave you a moment ago. That way we can ensure you receive full CLE credit. Also, be sure to check out the events page of our website, beasleyallen.com/events, as we're going to be adding more webinars throughout the year. For anyone that needs ethics credit, and we all need that ethics credit, we're going to offer an ethics webinar in November. That will be in November. Last but not least, I want to encourage all of you to register for our August webinar on the Camp Lejeune water contamination litigation. Ron Jones and Matt Pettit will host the Camp Lejeune webinar on Wednesday, August 17 at 11 a.m. Go ahead and sign up now as slots are filling up fast. Last but not least, if you have questions during the webinar today, I want you to use the question and answer feature at the bottom of your screen. That's the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We're going to save some time at the end of today's presentation to make sure we answer all of your questions. And if you don't feel comfortable submitting your question that way, feel free to email our two presenters today directly. They'll be happy to answer your questions. So with that, let's meet our two speakers. Jennifer Emmel joined Beasley Allen in 2013 as a member of our mass tort section. Jennifer earned her undergraduate degree in biology with a double minor in physics and chemistry from the University of Wisconsin, Eau Claire. Jennifer went on to obtain a Ph.D. from the University of South Carolina School of Medicine, where her degree was in biomedical science with a focus on molecular oncology. If that weren't enough, she went on to earn her J.D. from Gonzaga University School of Law. And during her time at Beasley Allen, Jennifer has focused on cases consolidated in multi-district litigation to include the Johnson & Johnson and Emerus talcum powder MDL, several of the transvaginal mesh MDLs, and a host of other cases. She is a remarkable scientist and a scholar, and we are just delighted to have her on our team, and we're delighted to have her here today. My partner, Clinton Richardson, is also in Beasley Allen's mass tort section. Over the past several years, Clinton has actively worked on the Juul litigation, the Juul vaping litigation. He received his undergraduate degree from the University of Alabama and his Juris Doctor from Faulkner University. Before joining our firm, Clinton litigated matters in the areas of employment discrimination, federal criminal defense, and Section 1983 litigation. Clinton also worked for the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Alabama, where he prosecuted False Claims Act cases, defended against claims premised on the Federal Tort Claims Act, and responded to numerous habeas petitions. Clinton is and has been a real asset to our firm since his arrival. I am absolutely delighted to have him join us today. So Clinton, Jennifer, please feel free to get started whenever you're ready.
Thank you, David. During today's webinar, we will provide you some background information about social media, about what led Beasley Allen to sue Facebook and Instagram, and where things currently stand in this litigation. Note that While much of this discussion focuses on Facebook, this litigation effort addresses wrongful conduct by both Facebook and Instagram. Facebook has owned Instagram since 2012, and in October of last year, the platforms announced their decision to be collectively called the Meta platforms. Social media really came into existence in the early 2000s. Depending on your age, some of you may remember MySpace, which was the first social media platform to reach 1 million active users. Believe it or not, at one point, MySpace was more popular than Google. Today, a quarter of teens report using social media almost constantly. And the average person uses social media 2 hours and 27 minutes each day. Facebook has grown exponentially over the last 10 years. It had 100 million users in 2008. It had 2.9 billion active users in 2021. As you all know, Facebook and Instagram don't charge you to create an account. They make most of their money from allowing companies to advertise on their platforms. In 2019, Facebook made $69.7 billion in advertising. In 2021, its ad revenue was $115 billion. Simply put, the more time users spend on the platforms, the more companies want to buy advertising. Stated differently, the more time users spend on Facebook and Instagram, the more money Facebook and Instagram make. In 2017, Facebook noticed that users were not liking and sharing content as much as they had in past years. User interaction was decreasing, which meant Facebook's value as an advertising tool for companies was decreasing. Facebook was becoming less valuable. Facebook decided it had to quickly change or it would lose billions of dollars. In September 2021, the Wall Street Journal began to run a series of publications based on internal Facebook documents. At that time, the source of the documents was unknown to the public. The documents show that since at least 2019, Facebook has known that prolonged use of the platform causes mental and physical harm to teens, often in ways only Facebook fully understands. Facebook's own documents show that prolonged use of the Meta platforms makes body image issues worse for 33% of teenage girls. That 13% of those with suicidal thoughts attribute those thoughts to use of the platforms. And that 17% say Facebook makes eating disorders worse. Knowing this, Facebook still formed a team to plan how to market to preteens and actively contemplated whether there is a way Facebook could engage with younger children during play dates. During an October 3rd, 2021 episode of 60 Minutes, Frances Haugen, a former Facebook employee, was revealed as the source of the Wall Street Journal's information. 2 days later, on October 5th, 2021, she testified before Congress regarding her experience and observations as a Facebook employee. She explained that to counteract the 2017 user decline, Facebook made substantial changes to its platform to increase the amount of time users spend on the platform. Prior to 2018, Facebook's newsfeed was organized chronologically to show the most recent content at the top of the page. In 2018, it implemented changes to amplify content that Facebook determined is the most reactive, because Facebook concluded that reactive content would draw the most attention and therefore make Facebook the most money. Reactivity was measured by what Facebook calls meaningful social interaction, or MSI. Notably, one Facebook executive said, "Our algorithms exploit the human brain's attraction to divisiveness. If left unchecked, Facebook would feed users more and more divisive content in an effort to gain user attention and increase time on the platform." The 2018 change centers on negative content and works to overwhelm users with this content as soon as they log onto the platforms. Maybe most concerning, Ms. Haugen detailed Facebook's failure to warn the public of the dangers of the platforms, despite knowing that the parents of today's children largely lack the skills needed to advise children on how to safely interact with social media, because these parents did not interact with social media when they were children. It must be understood that there is an additional component beyond Facebook's development of content through its MSI algorithm. For many years now, Facebook has devised ways to use technology-driven behavior manipulation to push its users into this endless compulsion to access the platforms. Some describe Facebook's efforts to manipulate users as persuasive design, others dark patterns. Without telling users, Facebook employs top mental health experts to use persuasive technology to change the way humans think and act. The full extent to which Facebook manipulates users is presently unknown, but it is understood that the like feature and the wavy dots used to reflect that someone is currently writing you a message are very small parts of Facebook's hidden tactic designed to exploit psychological vulnerabilities and force users into dangerous, addiction-like engagement with the Facebook and Instagram platforms. To date, the Beasley Allen law firm has filed 13 lawsuits against Facebook and Instagram. All filings are individual personal injury actions alleging theories of product liability, negligence, fraud, and unjust enrichment. This is not a class action, which involves a single lawsuit filed on behalf of many people with similar injuries. Nor is this a multi-district litigation, or MDL, which involves multiple lawsuits all managed by one judge prior to trial. We have filed lawsuits in Alabama, Delaware, Texas, California, Missouri, Georgia, Florida, Illinois, and Tennessee. We plan to file in many more jurisdictions across the country before the end of this year.
So currently our defendants are Meta, which includes Facebook and Instagram. Instagram being the top social media app for Gen Z users between ages 16 and 24. There are additional Meta apps as well as labs, including Messenger, WhatsApp, Meta Quest, which is a virtual platform. There's also Facebook Portal, which is video calling. There are regulations that pertain to the conditions under which commercial websites can target children under age 13, but there are few of them. The most relevant being COPPA, which is Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. And COPPA requires website operators and platforms to obtain verifiable parental consent from parents prior to collection or use of information from children under age 13. Now, the problem with verifiable parental consent is it's very difficult for platforms such as Meta, which have so many users, to obtain consent from every parent. So they've chosen simply to avoid these obligations by purporting to ban all those users under age 13 through its terms of service. So when a user signs up for an account, it will ask the user for their age. They put in a birth date. As long as that birth date indicates the user is 13 or older, they can get an account. Now, these are not very effective age verification protocols, and Meta knows this. In 2020, a Pew Research study found that 11% of children aged 9 to 11 use Instagram and 6% use Facebook. In 2021, Meta removed at least 600,000 underage user accounts. And again, that is just what Meta found and what Meta reported. There are also regulations that are going into effect or in some degree of the legislative process. So one of them being CPRA, or California Privacy Rights Act. That act will become effective January 1st, 2023. And that actually builds on the California Consumer Privacy Act. And it requires consent to collect data from consumers between ages 13 and 15. So they actually have to go to the 13 to 15-year-old user, ask for consent to collect their data. And then for users under age 13, they also need to get consent from the parent. It also broadens the definition of knowledge. Actual knowledge of age is required, but under this act, willful disregard is also considered actual knowledge. Again, if there's actual knowledge that a user is under age 13, a method of verification that a parent gave consent is necessary. There's also Assembly Bill 2486 that is in committee. That's also in California. It establishes an office for the protection of children online. And that office is charged with ensuring that digital media that is available to children are designed, provided, and accessed in a manner that duly protects the privacy, civil liberties, and mental and physical well-being of children. In Virginia and Colorado, there is also legislation where they are going to classify any personal data collected from a known child as sensitive data, and that has additional protections. In Connecticut, there's legislation under review where parental consent is required for children under 16, so they're increasing the age. So what is Facebook addiction? It's actually a term coined by researchers, and it's applied to individuals who engage in excessive, compulsive Facebook use, and it's for the purposes of mood alteration, and there are negative personal outcomes. So social media platforms addict individuals by exploiting not only psychology, but also physiology. And they do that in a way that dopamine-driven feedback loops are developed. And ultimately, users are constantly, compulsively checking their apps to get the rewards being notifications, likes, things like that, that cause dopamine release. And dopamine activity is described in this chart. So when a user first learns a process, first begins a process, they have a baseline level of dopamine. And they get a cue, which would be the like. And then they get the reward. They go to the page, they see their like, they see a comment by somebody. That's the reward. And that is how the process works in the learning phase. But then as they use it more and more, they begin to expect the reward. So they have their baseline dopamine level. They get more dopamine when the cue or the notification happens. And then for a reward, they kind of go back to baseline. And over time, they still get the dopamine release during the cue, but instead of a reward, they get less of a positive response, less of a positive euphoria because they are undergoing conditioning. And because of Facebook and Instagram's business model, as Clinton said, it's imperative that these social media apps are designed to keep the users hooked on the screen longer. And they do that through these design techniques that exploit psychology and physiology to essentially turn users into junkies. And in doing so, they get increased screen time, they get additional user clicks, and there's additional advertising revenue for the company. This is not a new concept. There's a book called Hooked that was published in 2014 that proposed the hook model. It's a 4-phase process used by companies to build these habit-forming products. So there's a trigger, there's an action, you get a reward, and then put in an investment. And some of the features that Facebook is using in this addictive process are laid out here in this timeline. So in 2004, Facebook is launched. Between 2006 and 2008, there's the news feed feature that is launched. Then Facebook goes to mobile phones and apps, and now becomes accessible to users all the time, everywhere. There's also the creation of the like button, which is arguably one of the most addictive features of Facebook and Instagram. Between 2009 and 2016, algorithms were created. Feature posts started showing up in the news feed, and Facebook reactions were launched, which are also addictive. And Instagram is also launched during that period. In 2017, Clinton was talking about meaningful social interactions. That concept was launched during 2017, the end of 2017, and it prioritizes content that gets more comments, that gets more likes, that gets more interaction. And by 2020 to 2021, the Facebook algorithm essentially prioritizes everything the user sees in their newsfeed. So looking at the likes introduced in 2009, it is one of the most popular addictive aspects of Facebook. And the allure is that the like is essentially the reward for the user. They get validation, and they get this feeling of approval from their peers, which for teens and adolescents, children, it's very important to them to get peer approval. And when likes are released, the user goes back to see who liked it, and it's just one way to get the user coming back. Other reactions were introduced in 2016. So when the like is essentially hit, it causes the user brain to release dopamine. And over time, the brain adapts to that dopamine. And it does so by reducing the number of dopamine receptors. So you can have the same amount of dopamine released, but less of a feeling of euphoria. And the algorithms are designed to get the user to counteract that by going back more often for another dose of euphoria. So you don't feel quite the same high, but you go back more often to get it more often. And as this period continues over time, minors and young users will continue to use Facebook and Instagram, but it's not to get the same amount of high. It's just to simply feel normal. It's simply to get to that baseline feeling. And further down the road, the more users use Facebook and social media, they will experience withdrawal after they stop using or reduce use of social media. And those withdrawal symptoms are very similar to withdrawal symptoms one would get from any addictive substance, including anxiety, irritability, insomnia, and craving. So another method to addict users is by spacing out those dopamine triggering stimuli. They're called intermittent variable rewards. And that allows what is known as anticipation of the reward and craving for the reward to develop and to intensify. And that strengthens the effect of the reward once the user receives it. And that also strengthens the addiction. So for Facebook and Instagram, these intermittent variable rewards include things like likes, notifications, comments. And Meta will actually space out the notifications of likes and comments into little bursts. So for example, if you post a picture and you get 10 likes within the first 5 minutes you post it, you don't actually, the poster doesn't actually see that they got 10 likes right away. They'll see 2 likes. And maybe 10 minutes later, they'll see 2 more likes. And so on. So rather than notifying that user in real time, they space it out to maximize the addictiveness. And that also takes advantage of the desire for social validation. They want to see who is liking their posts, and one way to addict users. Push notifications are another type of messaging that will pull users back onto the Facebook platform. So they are things like where a friend tagged you in a Facebook photo, or a friend posts a photo and it notifies you that a friend posted a picture. So it's something that if the user is off the platform, it will draw the user back to the platform. And that, that plays to a user's uncertainty in themselves, and it plays to that desire for approval. And it also appeals to the fear of missing out. The fear of missing out being now the user sees that their friends are online, their friends are doing some activity that they're not a part of. They want to know what that is because they don't want to miss out. They want to know what's going on. There's also the infinite scroll feature, which is on both Facebook and Instagram, where the user will keep scrolling through this endless stream of content, and it's all new. So you'll get different posts from people. The user will like certain posts and will keep on scrolling to find additional posts that they like. The scrolling is a lot easier than simple clicking or simply going to other users' accounts or pages. And so it's a lot easier to use, and the user will stay on longer. And also in apps like Instagram and Twitter, there's a slight delay in response when the user pulls up the screen and refreshes the screen. That also builds anticipation, and there's a dopamine release. So in late 2017, Facebook had a problem, and Clinton mentioned it earlier. Users were actually commenting less, they were posting less, they were sharing posts less than they had in the past. And the internal Facebook documents show that Facebook was concerned about this. They were concerned about the decline in popularity, which was among teenagers and young adults. And it showed, their research showed that US teenagers spent 16% less time on Facebook, and young adults spent 5% less time. So their response to that was to revamp the newsfeed. And they transitioned away from a chronological ranking of posts and news stories and content to content that had what was called more meaningful social interaction. And meaningful social interaction was based on an amplification algorithm, and it was based on engagement and considered how many likes a post had gotten, how many shares, how many comments, as well as whether the user had liked similar posts in the past. So for example, if a user liked fishing posts in the past, if a fishing post was posted, someone catching a fish, that user would, it was ranked based on how many likes that post got, and that post would come up on the user's feed at the top. So how these algorithms ranked the interactions were based on the number of likes, they were based on comments, and each of these things, each of these measurements were assigned a value. So for example, a positive like was given a score of 1. Comments were given a higher score because now a user is interacting with them and actually commenting on them. Reshares were given a higher content. Incidentally, the like button was actually given less of a value than an anger reaction. So essentially what was happening was they were assigning a higher value to negative posts than to positive ones. And in doing so, they were considering that posts that had a negative value or a negative reaction tended to keep users more engaged. People would engage with other users over negative content. So this meaningful social interaction scoring would choose the information that a user would likely find most appealing. And that's what they would post on the newsfeed, what would be posted on their newsfeed. And not only would that be what the user would like more, that was what Facebook wanted more, because the user would then stay online more and push screen time up. So in addition to the physiological aspects, the dopamine loops, there's also a behavioral addiction component. And that's characterized as being the user is overly concerned about social media. They have an uncontrollable urge to log on, to use social media, and they put so much time into social media that it impairs other areas of their life, for example, school or work. And psychologists estimate that as many as 5 to 10% of Americans meet the criteria for social media addiction today. So research started into what the effects were in social media, and Facebook itself actually did some experimentation. The proactive incident response experiment began in 2019, and that included researching the effect of Meta on the mental health of today's youth. And Meta's own in-depth analyses showed significant mental health issues stemming from the use of Instagram among teenage girls, many of whom linked suicidal thoughts and eating disorders to their experiences on the app. Meta's researchers have repeatedly found that Instagram is harmful to a sizable percentage of teens. And in 2019, an internal presentation concluded, we make body issues worse for 1 in 3 teen girls. And teens blame Instagram for increases in the rate of anxiety and depression. Meta also learned that 5 to 6% of 14-year-olds admit to problematic use, which is Facebook's term for addiction to the platform. So social media addiction looks a lot like other types of addiction, like substance addiction, and includes things like mood modification. So the user will engage in social media, they'll either be happier or they'll be more depressed. Salience, which is a preoccupation with social media. Tolerance, this again goes to the conditioning effect, where an ever increasing amount of social media use is necessary over time to get that same feeling of euphoria. Withdrawal symptoms. So again, this is very much similar to other addictions in that when the user ceases using social media or decreases use, they will experience both physical and emotional symptoms. Conflict. Users will begin having problems in relationships because of their social media usage. And then relapse. So after an individual abstains from using social media for a period of time, that individual will quickly revert back to excessive use as soon as they're able to. So the consequences that are seen due to the social media addiction will be things like a decline in academic performance. They will have sleep disruption. For example, the user will be online, at 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. They will experience anxiety. They will show depression. They will also have, again, this negative impact on their real life relationships. Some people may become more withdrawn, and they will experience social anxiety disorders. So how much is too much internet use? There's what is called the Goldilocks hypothesis, where it's either too hot, too cold, or just right. Well, children who do not have any access to social media use actually exhibit a lesser happiness or lesser sense of well-being than individuals who do use social media. But 27% of children who spend more than 3 hours a day on social media exhibit poor mental health. So there is a sort of range between a half hour to 2.5 hours or so where effects are not seen as much of social media, but above 3 hours, there's a definite impact. And according to documents, Facebook continues to expand the size of its young adult audience, despite its own research showing that platforms can have a negative effect on their mental health and their well-being. And Facebook's internal research claims that Facebook's platforms make body image issues worse for 1 in 3 teen girls. Facebook's internal research also found that 13.5% of teen girls on Instagram say the platform makes thoughts of suicide and self-injury worse, and 17% say the platform, which Facebook owns, makes eating issues such as anorexia worse. So Facebook is well aware of the harm that it poses to teens and adolescents and children. They are aware that teens often lack the ability to self-regulate. There is a portion of the brain that is more active in the reward cycle. And in teens and young adults, that active portion of the brain is much more active in teens and young adults than it is in teens and young adults than it is in older adults. And that's partly because there's a portion of the brain called the prefrontal cortex that is the thinking and rationalizing portion of the brain that is not as developed at that age and does not fully develop until age 25. So Facebook is aware that there is more of an absence of impulse control and that teens are unable to sort of resist the allure of the platform and getting on Facebook. Frances Haugen asserted that Facebook Chief Executive Officer Mark Zuckerberg personally approved the engagement-based algorithm and other features as he did in other instances where there was a prospective feature that could increase Facebook's revenue, even to the detriment of users' well-being. So a lot of individuals who use social media think that it makes them feel happier. And to them, they will actually say that they will assign it a value of higher importance, that it's more important in their life than certain other things. But actually, based on the effects that they report, it actually makes them feel worse. So in 2018, Walton proposed in a paper the definition for classic addiction, which is something that keeps us coming back, even though it often has a negative effect on our mental health. So this is very much what Facebook and social media it keeps the user coming back, even though they're experiencing these negative effects. And as I said, Facebook is aware of how social media impacts our society. And while he addressed a group of Stanford students, he confessed that the short-term dopamine-driven feedback loops, which were created by social media apps, are destroying how society works. So how can these harms be mitigated? They can actually be. And in Europe and Scandinavian countries, research as well as regulations are more advanced as compared to those in the US. And Google and perhaps also other social media platforms are actually limiting hours that notifications are sent to minors. These social media platforms can do that. They can also limit hours that the minors can access social media platforms. So maybe they can only access the platform until 10 p.m., except for on a weekend. They can limit targeted marketing to minors. They can also limit which features and algorithms are being used on platforms that are being used by minors. So, and which accounts are being used by minors. They can also require images by social media influencers be identified when they're enhanced. And that is also being done, required in some of the Scandinavian countries. So if a social media influencer posts a picture where a filter has been used to change skin tone, to make someone look thinner, it has to be identified as that the image was enhanced. So the cases that we are interested in involve users of either or both of Facebook or Instagram. The user has to have started using one or both of the platforms before age 21. The user also commonly uses or has used one or both platforms more than 3 hours per day. The user has to have suffered one or more injuries or conditions investigated related to their use of the platform. And the next slide has those conditions. They also either have to have received treatment or counseling for the injury or condition, or they have to have suffered the injury for 6 months or more and did not seek treatment for some significant reason, such as the treatment wasn't available, they couldn't afford the treatment, they didn't have access to the treatment, some significant reason that they could not get treated. So the injuries that we're looking at include lack of focus, ADD or ADHD, depression, anxiety, body dysmorphia, eating disorders, including anorexia and bulimia, thoughts of self-harm, actual self-harm, things like cutting, suicidal ideation, suicide attempt, and suicide. And these harms should also have occurred after use of social media started. So one of the last thoughts that I want to leave you with is that the decision to focus on meaningful social interactions was commented on by an associate professor at UMass Amherst. And he indicated that that was the kind of change that would require thousands of different ways of testing it, because you're really just rewiring the whole network. So you have to be phenomenally careful and phenomenally thoughtful about how you do it. And unfortunately, Meta, Facebook, and Instagram were not. There you are.
I am here. I am here. Jennifer Clinton, on behalf of all our viewers, I want to thank you for bringing us a really thoughtful and thorough presentation. We've received a few questions today, and if you'll allow me, I'd like to present them to you and get your feedback. Would that be okay?
Absolutely.
That would be great.
All right, so our first question comes from Tom, who asks, what is the statute of limitations on these claims? Is it told until the child turns 21? Good question.
The statute of limitations varies from state to state. Most states do have some variation of minor tolling that will toll it up until the minor reaches the age of majority, whether that be teen like it is in most states, 19 like it is in Alabama, and I think a few states actually have this majority that extend up to 21.
Okay.
And then also there's the question of is there some sort of a discovery rule where that might be triggered with the whistleblower Francis Haugen coming forth. So.
Okay. Well, while I'm waiting for other questions to come in, I have a few questions myself, if you don't mind my pitching them to you. My first question is, what sort of experts would you typically work with in a meta-injury case?
So we need to work with the psychologists and or psychiatrists, because there is the medical aspect of the actual structural and functional brain changes. We also have to work with behavioral psychologists, to evaluate the clients, to see that they fit into the criteria, to see that, to develop a causation, that social media did indeed cause these questions, to do a multifactorial analysis on them, and diagnosis, to rule out other causes. So that's one category. We also need epidemiologists who can focus on the literature. There are at least a good dozen meta-analyses out there that focus on this question, and those meta-analyses encompass hundreds of smaller studies and come to a conclusion. We also need to work with computer and data scientists, because as far as I'm aware, this is a very, very complex case with regard to what information does Meta have? Does Meta even know that they have it? And how is that data stored? It's my understanding they can track many aspects of these users, including, if the user has their app open, for example, you go on your phone, your app is always open, you don't have to sign in. As long as you're signed into that app, Meta is tracking what websites the user is going to during that period of time. So, it's a very complex procedure to track down the data and determine what that data is. So computer science is going to be a huge aspect of it.
You brought up an issue that raises another question in my mind, and it's this: for our viewers who may be contacted by meta-related injury victims or potential victims, what sort of ESI preservation precautions do they need to take, or have those potential meta injury victims take?
What we're advising our clients to do is maintain possession of any devices that you have used to access social media in the past. More specific to your question about ESI, also the data that's reflected on your social media platforms on Facebook and Instagram. We're asking our clients to not delete any posts, do not alter pages that you have already liked or groups that you've already joined. It's a possibility that some of that content will not necessarily be relevant to the claims at issue in this litigation, but we won't know that until we do a deep dive of that with the various experts that we retain. So we're asking them to just preserve it in place until we can do a fulsome analysis of what we will need as we proceed forward.
Okay. We got another question from a viewer. Robert asks, have you considered litigation against other companies promoting online addictive activities that minors are engaged in?
We have considered that. We understand that one analog to social media compulsion, social media addiction is gaming addiction. And we understand that there are, among other online websites, online platforms, many issues with games that users engage with online that can lead to similar results with prolonged exposure. So we're evaluating a variety of different entities that may be responsible for similar injuries that are an issue in this case.
One of the things with Facebook and Instagram, too, is that Facebook and Instagram both act as sort of a hub to other websites and as a sort of doorway to other platforms. So for example, if you go to a platform and it will ask you if you want to log in with your Facebook credentials, you know, how liable is Facebook for what's going on those other platforms? And those are some of the things that we're looking at currently, especially if some of those other platforms are recommended for users 17 and above, whereas Facebook has 13. So, and you know, Facebook is aware that there's a 13-year-old who is accessing those websites with their credentials. So that's one of the aspects that we're looking at as well. And just one point on the ESI as well, your prior question. We also want to make sure that we're preserving all these user handles and email accounts that are linked to all of these accounts. Because while Facebook can determine, you know, some that are linked to the same user, it's a lot easier if we have all the information. Oh, David, you're muted. David,
I'm so sorry. Yeah, little slip of the mouse there. Are there certain states or venues that have thrown up either court-imposed or legislative roadblocks to these types of claims? I guess it put differently, do these claims work better in some states rather than others?
That's something that we're still evaluating. One key potential impediment that we intend to tackle head on as we proceed forward is CDA 230 immunity. What CDA 230 immunity effectively does is it immunizes internet service providers like Facebook and Instagram from content that is created by third parties. So, you know, one user posts something that is negative or hurtful. It immunizes Facebook and Instagram from being sued directly for the simple fact that that was posted. One reason why we believe that that immunity is not applicable here is our concern is not, so to speak, the content that an individual posted, but it's the way the MSI algorithms modify that content in a way it amplifies that content such that you cannot access these platforms without being inundated with it. And you couple that with the problem of, you know, the intentional efforts to make these platforms so addictive. They're basically compelled to access these platforms over and over, several hours throughout the day, and they're inundated with negative content at such an impressionable period in their lives.
We've got another viewer question that's come in. John asks, are you also researching compulsive usage of other platforms such as TikTok, Snapchat, YouTube, etc.?
We certainly are. That's something that we definitely are exploring. We do believe that there are some similarities between the way the, for lack of a better term, news feeds are organized for those other platforms. That's something that we're trying to get more information on. And, you know, as additional data comes in, we will definitely revise our theories of liability as appropriate.
I think that's one of those things that will also be determined by discovery, because we need to know how much the platform is actually manipulating what the user sees. Because, you know, if they are immune, if everyone is seeing, you know, content that is just put on the platform by other users, by third parties, they're all seeing it equally. But here we have a case where essentially data is being shuttled to users. It's people, certain users are seeing more of it than other users are. And so, I mean, that's one of those things that's going to come out in discovery. And so we'll need to look at not only Facebook and Instagram, and the whistleblower helped that a lot because we started getting some of those documents. But, you know, with regard to other social media platforms, that's something we need to look into.
And just to piggyback on what Jennifer said here and going back to something she said in her presentation, I think that's similar to the explanation of the rankings assigned through the MSI algorithm, how the negative content receives a value that Facebook prioritizes in terms of the content that individuals see. So whereas one individual will see one type of content or have one experience on social media, Another individual will have a different experience on social media based off the data that Facebook is actively collecting on its users on a day-to-day basis.
Very good, John. Good question. So we'll give it another minute or so for any remaining questions to trickle in, but this is probably a good time for me to go back over our housekeeping notes. Some of you may have missed these earlier, but, and for those of you who did, a copy of today's presentation is uploaded in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. And we've also uploaded an evaluation form for you to return. You can fill it out, return it to webinars@beasleyallen.com. Every attendee will receive an email that will include the form, the evaluation form, the presentation, and a link to the video. Again, for those of you who are participating by phone, we need you to email your name and phone number to webinars@beasleyallen.com to ensure you receive full CLE credit. Also, I want to encourage you again, check out the events page of our website, beasleyallen.com/events, as we'll be adding more webinars throughout the year. Our next webinar is scheduled for Wednesday, August 17 at 11 a.m. That's going to be hosted by Ron Jones and Matt Pettit, who are going to bring you a top-notch overview of the Camp Lejeune water contamination litigation. A few more questions have trickled in. If you guys don't mind sticking around to answer that. I see we've got a few more minutes, so here we go. Michael writes, it would be interesting to see if similar adjustments are made by Meta for older users who might be more vulnerable to suggestion. What do you guys think of that idea?
I think that's definitely a component to think about. So there are conditions like ADHD, individuals who already have some form of depression and other forms of mental illness, where they are more susceptible to addiction and to addiction for things like not only social media use, but like gaming, like gambling. So, I mean, I'm not sure, you know, exactly what would the remedy be in this case, but maybe at least some sort of a warning, you know, and as awareness becomes more prevalent of the issues.
And on a macro level, I do believe that it's reasonable to think that additional changes are forthcoming. I understand, for example, that shortly after Frances Haugen testified before Congress on October 5th, 2021, Facebook announced its intent in 2022 to allow users the ability to change between chronological ranking and MSI ranking. So I do believe that the companies are becoming aware of the public's awareness of the problems with their platforms, and they are becoming increasingly concerned regarding the consequences of what they have done.
All right, we've had a few more questions trickle in. Most of these are about logistical issues, so I'm going to throw that out for our webinar host to hopefully answer for us. A few people have asked about their chat box being disabled and not being able to access the notes or the CLE confirmation form. As I understand it, that's something our webinar team can address either before we conclude today or after the conclusion of today's meeting. The webinar email address, again, for those of you participating by phone, or if you have questions, for those of you who have questions about your chat box feature or about trying to access any of the forms or materials related to today's presentation, reach out to webinars@beasleyallen.com. That's BEASLEYALLEN.com. Webinars@beasleyallen.com, and one of our staffers will absolutely help you and get an answer to your question. So if there are no more substantive questions, I want to thank everyone again for joining us today. Jennifer, Clinton, fantastic job. Thank you for that wonderful overview. And thanks to everyone for supporting our Beasley Allen webinar series. We look forward to seeing you all next month. Go ahead and register now, as sign up is limited. Thanks and have a good day.